In this episode, I'm joined by Russell Berman, who is an American professor of German studies and comparative literature. He is the author of multiple books, including The Rise of the Modern German Novel, Crisis and Charisma, and Cultural Studies of Modern Germany, History, Representation, and Nationhood. In this episode, we talk about Ernst Junger's novel Eumeswil and his concept of the Anarch, alongside discussions on violence, myth, and ideology. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you wish to support Hermetics or wish to join the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Russell Berman, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetics podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So just before we jump in, we're going to be discussing two works by Ernst Junger. Eumeswil, I hope that's the correct pronunciation. I've never had to pronounce it out loud. So Eumeswil and The Forest Passage. Before we jump in on those, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first came across the work of Junger.
Sure. Well, I was originally a scholar of German literature. That's what I did my graduate work in. Over the years, my areas of interest have expanded: critical theory, Frankfurt School, more politics and history. Also figures from the left and from the right. From the right, Ernst Junger, Carl Schmitt. I've worked on translations and introduced some volumes of his, and so forth. I do many things. What I have done is work on Junger as well. I first encountered Ernst Junger when I was a graduate student working on 20th century German literature. I remember discussions of the Marble Cliffs in a seminar with the late scholar of German literature, Egon Schwartz, a wonderful person, wonderful teacher, great book on Rilke. And then later I wrote a book about the German modernist novel. And in my book, The Rise of the Modern German Novel, I talk about Der Arbeiter, the worker, which is a very long essay, one could say, by Junger from the early 1930s. Not exactly a novel, but the categories he worked with are important for me. And since then, I've continued to come back to Junger as an important writer of the modern German 20th century and an important thinker, period.
The Worker is a book which, even for Junger, is peculiar, and his style in it is extremely different to the rest of his work. I've yet to really get my head around that book.
Should I give a little bit of an overview of the trajectory of Junger's career? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Okay. Well, he lives a very long life. His first important work from the standpoint of what is read is in the Storm of Steel, Stahlgewitter of 1920, which is his memoirs from his time in the First World War. And that's often read in courses about World War I, World War literature. Sometimes he's accused of beautifying the war. I don't think he does that. It's certainly strangely devoid of nationalism, but he does talk about the visual experience of war, while at the same time quite aware of the devastation, the death, and the suffering. In the 1920s, in Germany, it's the Weimar Republic, the first real democracy in Germany. Junger is part of a camp. It's not an organization anyway, the Conservative Revolution. They're skeptics of democracy, but not in a traditionalist sense. They're not about a return to the Kaiser, but in a long history of critics or skeptics about democracy, they develop a range of stances. Some of the conservative revolutionaries end up as Nazis. Some of the conservative revolutionaries end up as anti-Nazi resistance fighters executed by Nazis. So there's no easy political categorization. Junger participates in a criticism of Nazism with his famous Marble Cliffs book of 1939. It's not a roman à clé. It's not it's not easily read as a precise description of the Hitler and his henchmen, but it is clearly a critique of tyranny, and it was read as a critique of the regime, and it was therefore taken largely taken out of circulation. But he continues to write in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Eumeswil, the novel that you struggle to pronounce, is from 1979, I believe, 1977, excuse me. He has a long life, and there's actually reportedly a deathbed conversion to Catholicism. So there's he goes through many phases. He's not easily categorized, from the war literature of the 1920s to kind of post-apocalyptic science fiction of Eumeswil. He writes in many different genres.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's also, I think, a couple of texts where are on primarily about his interest in bugs and insects. So there's a very peculiar. He's, as you say, not someone who's easily pinned down. And he also, after I recently did an episode on the philosophy of Emil Cioran, who mm-hmm. Junger was a friend with and stayed with for a long time, who seems to me in a way a strange sort of antithesis of Junger's outlook, yet they both enjoyed each other's work. So mm-hmm. he's not someone who's easy to pin down. But before we jump in on specifics of Eumeswil and the Forest Passage, I do have to ask you the Hermetics question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. We could include Junger and add 3 others. So who would you pick?
Okay, I really enjoyed this question mm-hmm. because it reminds me of a scene in Eumeswil. I mentioned this kind of science fiction character, and there is an apparatus that allows one to travel through time, and part of the time travel through the luminar, that's the name of the piece, is involves going back to a wine cellar in Berlin in the 1840s, where Karl Marx was debating left Hegelians, who were, in a sense, proto-anarchists. And that debate between Marxists and anarchists continues to today. I think that's one frame you could put around what's taking place in Portland and Seattle. So I thought this is a very Jungerian question. Thank you very much. And I can't commit. I have a problem with committing in relationships, I guess. But the 3 that I was thinking of this past week, an odd group, I suppose, Michelangelo, the painter. I've been reading about the mystical message embedded in the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel. This is talked about in the novel The Second Scroll by A.M. Klein, whom the Canadian singer Leonard Cohen talks about as his teacher. So my first choice is Michelangelo. His second choice is Rosa Luxemburg, the German, Jewish, Polish socialist, proto-communist of the pre-First World War I era, World War I era, assassinated in 1919. I've been thinking about her because very much a committed leftist, but someone who articulates the first pretty emphatic criticism of Bolshevism in her writing on the Russian Revolution, which appeared posthumously in 1922. She, in that critique of Bolshevism, she has the famous phrase that freedom is always the freedom of the other, which is a remarkably, how should I put it, liberal, tolerant position, and one that one wishes were more disseminated today in this era of cancel culture. If one could just presume that one would always at least allow for the other side to speak, we'd be further along. The connection with Michelangelo is the imagery of the mass. The masses of flesh, the masses of bodies on the Sistine Chapel, and Luxemburg thinks a lot about the relationship of the mass, the working class, as opposed to the party. She's suspicious of the party as a vehicle for authoritarian disciplining, and instead she turns to the mass, the notion of the mass strike. And the third person third author that I'd like to include, probably, well, maybe less known, still living, a Syrian author who lives, I believe, in London in exile, Zachariah Tamer, Tamar, was born in Damascus in 1931. An autodidact author of short stories, of children's stories, of animal stories, and a very strong critic of oppression and by regimes, but also the cruelty of humans to other humans. There's a story in the volume "Tigers on the 10th Day" that I think gets very much to the substance of the dictatorial state. So those three: Michelangelo, Luxemburg, Tamer. That probably not a lot of overlap among the three, but I'd like to listen to what they have to say.
It seems to me that each one of those represents a theme running throughout Junger's work. So with Michelangelo, we have this mysticism. You've already mentioned the Storm and Steel sort of common understanding of that novel as this glorification of war, whereas it always seems to me that war for Junger was this absolute limit experience, which wasn't necessarily a glorification, but a transcendent sort of event, which was absolutely outside man. And I think Junger is quoted of saying that you don't return to the mystical, it returns to you. And it's sort of this unavoidable thing. And then with Luxemburg there, we have the critique of leftism, and then we have the sort of exile from one's nation, I guess. Is this why you picked the three, that they're sort of representative of areas of Junger's thought?
I picked the three because there's the three people who've been on my mind of late.
Okay.
And so is Junger. So there may be a more substantive common denominator. They're all concerned with the limits of private individuality without renouncing it. They're all concerned in different ways with endemic violence in the human experience. And I think that's where we would think about Junger. Although he establishes his writerly credentials as a war writer, he's certainly not a glorifier of war. What he isn't is a garden variety pacifist. It's more, as you suggested, that war is either a limit experience or war is an expression of violence that is simply existential in the human condition. And one can step out of war, but one doesn't step out of that violence. It is always about struggle.
I imagine these three thinkers and maybe some of these themes will return, but stepping into Eumeswil, how would you sort of... this is an extremely peculiar book. How would you sort of explain it to someone and describe this text?
Well, Eumeswil is a first-person narrative. One could think of it as a Bildungsroman, a novel of development, because the main figure, Manuel Venator, relates his life story from childhood until disappearing in the forest. It takes place in a location, a town, a city-state, Eumeswil, which appears to be located on the North African coast somewhere. And indeed, while writing this, Junger traveled to Morocco several times. But the setting is contingent on the assumption that the world system has fallen apart. There was an empire in the past. There was a cohesive state or system of states, and something transpired. And as we learn, something nuclear transpired in the past. So we're living among the survivors, and the survivors are organized in Eumeswil as members of a city-state ruled by a dictator, the Condor, and Eumeswil works in the Condor's palace, and he's anticipating some kind of coup or civil war or breakdown, and eventually he absconds. Along the way in this itinerary of his life, there's a good deal of essayism. By essayism, I mean something really in a kind of strict literary genre theoretical mode. It's a novel of ideas. There are long passages in which the plot doesn't move forward, but there are direct discussion by the narrator or by his characters of ideas. And these concern particularly questions of state organization, anarchism, and related topics that I'm sure we'll return to. So that's a map of Eumeswil. City-state narrative, personal narrative, post-apocalyptic, with a lot of science fiction. There are new inventions there. I mentioned one already, a kind of time machine. There are other elements that are like smartphones. But he's writing this in 1977, so that really is futuristic.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned that it's sort of insinuated that it's after the fall of an empire. Do you think this mirrors, when I come to think of the difference in Junger's thought between World War I and World War II, for him, I mean, obviously he matured a lot between those two wars, but for him there is a clear separation from any sort of reverence for a collective form or nationalistic form. Do you think that in the way that this is set after the fall of a great empire, that Junger, in a certain sense, perhaps this is a bit jumping to an assumption, but do you think that he might be talking about the French Revolution here, and that he is somewhat of a reactionary?
You would not be an outlier if you were insinuating that Junger is reactionary. He's clearly conservative in some vein, but not in any strictly ideological mode. He's certainly not a monarchist. There's not a nostalgia for a return to empire at all. In the Storm of Steel, where he's reporting on his fighting on the German side in the First World War, there's no Kaiser romanticism. There's no Hindenburg heroization. That's not what it's about. It's more the experience of the battlefield, the experience of the trenches, the experience of the soldier that's at stake. And in other war writing in the 1920s, this is one of the ways he was making his career. He'd write as a soldier, but not emphatically as a German soldier or a Prussian soldier, anything like that. And therefore, I don't see him as a nationalist writer in any way. Now, there is a difference between Junger post World War I and Junger post World War II. But there's a difference in Europe too. I mean, these are they're two devastating experiences with considerable continuity between them. You can think of them as one long war with shifting constellations. After the First World War in Germany, there is the experience of the first democracy, Weimar democracy, and he belongs to that wide spectrum of thinkers who worry about the character and consequences of democracy. There's certainly something elitist about him, but his criticism is along the lines that one can find on the left too. The sense that democracy isn't authentic, or democracy doesn't really give the people capacity to rule themselves, or democracy. Well, you hear this since ancient Greece, that democracy has a predisposition to turn into corruption or trivialization. But he really doesn't. He doesn't hammer on that. He's not an anti-democratic ideologue. He's a writer of the search for integrity of the individual, whatever the system. After the Second World War, there's no more enthusiasm. No more of the enthusiasm that was associated with the conservative revolution movement of the 1920s. And one could say that he retreats into his zoological studies that you mentioned before, or he engages in experimentation with the hallucinogenic drugs. That's another aspect of him. There's Junger, the LSD guy. But in Eumeswil, in any case, what I think we see is not so much a critique of the nation state, but a critique of the universal empire. And I'm using that term in the sense that it is used in Xenophon, in the debate between Leo Strauss and Alexander Kojève. Kojève is an internationalist. The vision of meta-regional, if not global, rule. The original version of that was Alexander. And since then, the Western imagination has been haunted by the prospect or the desideratum of a universal regime. And instead, Junger is looking. Junger, like Strauss, is very wary of that sense of universal rule because of the endemic authoritarian potential within that kind of seamless regime of power. Internationalism for Junger, I suppose, would represent a kind of no exit possibility of the total surveillance state. And that's what he wants to evade. But he wants to evade it through the specific agility of individual characters rather than through a collectivist movement for change.
Mm-hmm. It seems that when you're talking about Alexander and this great empire, the what sort of can or does allow that to continue itself is the idea of the collective and the collective support of such a notion. And this is the first question I've got with regard to Eumeswil, is that there is in the sort of the essayist section which you mentioned, there is a few sections where Junger or the protagonist is talking about how the specifics of history, names, dates, nations, etc., are less important than the movements and the effects on people's daily lives and the influence that these events have on the individual's life. And do you think this is where Junger begins his sort of understanding of freedom in Eumeswil, is from sort of one should remove themselves from these sort of grand narratives of great nations and titles and the idea of a sort of Alexandrian history, or Hegelian history, I should say.
Right. For Strauss, there's a line effectively in that debate from Alexander to Hegel to Stalin, and he's saying no, right? And Junger would also say no, although he's not in any ways a Straussian. Neither he nor Manuel, the Venator, the protagonist, is particularly interested in the details of history, the specifics of history. It's in that the post-apocalyptic character of Eumeswil is reminiscent of say the post-apocalyptic character of The Road, that novel by McCarthy, and it was filmed, where there's also an apocalypse. It's not clear what happened in the past. The issue is how you survive in the wake of the apocalypse. And I think that is a figure of thought that is central to the late Junger. And I think it's a figure of thought that I could identify in other modern German, maybe modern European thinkers. The point is not to wait around for the apocalypse. It has happened. Right? How do we survive now in its wake? What kinds of opportunities for integrity and survival exist in this rubble? That distance from grand narratives that you mentioned can certainly be taken as an indication of Eumeswils postmodernism. Right? If the critique of the grand narrative of consciousness or knowledge or history is a marker of postmodernism, per Lyotard, the postmodern condition, then that is certainly the case in Eumeswil, and I think that is also indicative maybe of a difference between post-World War I and post-World War II Junger. Post-World War I Junger, the conservative revolutionary, is still a revolutionary. He really thinks, he participates in circles of thought that aspire to emphatic revolutionary change. After World War II, there's a whole lot less appetite for committing oneself to this or that ism, because they're all going to go wrong. The issue is, as I repeat myself, how do you maintain integrity? How do you survive? How do you escape the clutches of the mechanisms of conformism that are grabbing at us perpetually?
Just as a short digression from that, it's interesting that you mentioned the road. I'm a big fan of Cormac McCarthy as well, and actually now you come to mention it, I hadn't made the connection before, but the probably my favourite novel, Blood Meridian, the character of the judge is actually highly representative of the kind of violence the mystical violence that Junger is speaking about in his war novels, the sort of unavoidable violence of nature, which you have no say as to whether or not it's going to come and destroy your civilization and uproot all your values.
I think that's good. Blood Meridian is an excellent interlocutor to Storm of Steel. Both investigate violence directly and without pulling punches, but it would be just a misreading of either to see them as a glorification of violence. Mm-hmm. They are statements, in many ways different statements, that violence, struggle, conflict, agonistics is what defines our existence. And Junger's criticism of the conformist world, certainly in the 1920s, but then again in the 1950s, 1960s, is the illusion that we are naturally harmonious and that conflict is naturally resolved. And the state is there to resolve conflicts and to guarantee peace. In fact, there's an existential level of brute conflict that one cannot eliminate from human life.
Do you think then for Junger that he sees the violence that we're talking about here, this unavoidable, almost a priori violence of reality, as the collective uses their systems of voting and the idea of a state that makes decisions to sort of remove themselves from any responsibility, and to actually the violence is just moved into another form? It's just the state now which is undertaking that in a different sort of, almost with just a different aesthetic.
I think that would be his critique of the state, especially after the 1950s. But I think he has a suspicion that there's a violence that roams the streets that is also a matter of non-state actors. It's the anarchist, which is for him, as you know, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, a a pejorative designation because of the ism. The anarchist would focus on state violence, the Gestapo at the door. But the anarch, which is Junger's alternative figure, who is not committed to an ism, but to the state of thriving outside of government, I think there's more of a Clockwork Orange vision here. It's not necessarily always political violence. Rather, violence is the condition in which human life, including politics, takes place.
Mm-hmm. And there's an interview with Junger when he talks about the difference between anarchism and the anarch, the anarchist, and the anarch very succinctly. And he says, the anarchist sees the ongoings in the world, has their thoughts and gets involved and has protests and activism and placards and et cetera, a real sort of puts themselves out there as a position against something, whereas the anarch sees what's going on, thinks their thoughts and retreats. And it seems... So for those that haven't read Eumeswil, the anarch is introduced in this novel as sort of Junger's personal sovereign method of escaping the things that he's critiquing.
That is the anarch.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Now again, one can't emphasize this difference sufficiently. There's the figure of thought of the anarchist, and there's the figure of thought of the anarch. As many of your listeners will know, much ink has been spent on the difference between an anarchist and a communist and a fascist. From Junger's point of view, thought through consistently, the common denominator is that they are all subservient to ism, to subordinating themselves to this or that party with this or that program, and they quickly give up their own thinking and their own survival. He does not want to have any of that. He does not want to have any of that self-subordination to a regime that controls him, whatever color the flag is that is flying. At one point, I believe it's in Forest Passage, he talks about you'll have the same demonstrations before and after the regime change. It's just the pictures of the leaders that are held up that will change. But in a sense, the same form continues. As opposed to that, you have the anarch. And in today's vernacular, we'd say this is someone who's prepared to go off the grid, who can find a way to live on his own for himself. It would include the survivalist, on your own, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. It just means maintaining a space of existential freedom, well aware that you're surrounded by threats. There is no guarantee of safety and peace. You have to be alert.
Mm-hmm. This is why Eumeswil was so sort of important to me personally, because of this idea of I think at least how I read the Anarch is that it's important to emphasize that it's, as you say, an existential space. And I don't personally think. Do you think the Anarch needs a physical space, or can the Anarch exist as a mental position within an ism? Not of the ism, but we're all within a state. I'm within the UK, but in terms of an Anarch could be within a state but still retain their Anarch outlook.
I think Junger's work challenges those of us who are sympathetic to his vision to try to answer that question. And my answer is that some will really go off the grid, try to find that physical space, as Manuel does in the novel. He tries to build a bunker outside the city. He disappears into the city, into the forest eventually. But I think one has to take that metaphorically, and there's an exhortation to find a way to live freely and with integrity, despite the crushing power of conformism associated with the state, with the culture industry, with the character of society in general. I'd put in an American sense, he's more Thoreau than he is Emerson. Thoreau, of course, did go out into the woods, but he didn't stay there. Emerson never took that step. In his writings, there is often a depiction of a movement away from a site of devastation, a site of defeat. That's certainly the way that Marble Cliffs ends, where the central figures flee the agents of tyranny. But I don't think he's necessarily calling for a physical departure. It's possible, but that's not the only way out. Footnote to this: there is an interesting line of thinking that circulates in parts of Silicon Valley. Curtis Yarvin has promoted it. The notion that the part of the specifically Anglo tradition is the willingness to move on, to move out of the ism, to move out of the domain and find some new place, and that's the way he frames the motion from England to the United States. In the United States, the moves westward, but today, including those visions, those utopian visions of seascaping, or indeed even the colonization of Mars.
Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this in the emails, but actually I interviewed Curtis Yarvin on this show, and his recent writing, Grey Mirror of the Nihilist Prince, is directly influenced by Eumeswil, which is one of the reasons I contacted you about it. So I'm sort of smiling here for the fact that you actually know who Yarvin is, because he's a fairly obscure thinker. But his idea of what he calls political detachment, and not in very short, feeding the beast of leftism, because it always needs something to react against, is, as he said to me, highly influenced by Eumeswil and the Anarch.
Yeah, no, I know Curtis. I know his writing, and there is clearly a significant similarity, particularly in this figure of motion away from the domain to some new space of freedom. But I guess I'm arguing that space of freedom does not necessarily have to mean a physical departure. There could be other forms.
Yeah, I really liked your idea of the difference between Emerson and Thoreau, because one of the criticisms of Thoreau with respect to Walden and his time at Walden is that now that we can look back into some of the reports at the time, apparently he wasn't very far from his house, and he still his mother brought him meals occasionally, and he was still sort of had this connection to civilization, apparently. And I always thought that that's actually a very silly criticism, because he seems to me, as you sort of stated, a sort of an anarch figure, in that he existed in his anarch space, let's say, in his hut, but at the same time, as you said earlier, understood that civilization isn't going anywhere, and there's still going to be attacks, and it's still there as a thing. And it's almost as if, for the anarch, there still needs to be a relationship with modernity or civilization, or what it was, or the empire, because it's not going anywhere. So you need to almost be on guard against that, as Thoreau was. So I think those criticisms of Thoreau are always quite silly, really.
I agree, and the program to limit one's integration and dependency on the empire or the domain does not necessarily mean one severs all relations altogether. The fact that all relations are not severed, however, does not mean that one is inescapably in the middle of the empire either. And I think the clearest proof of this would be with reference to the question of language. If I choose to separate myself, if I choose an Anarch's Path, I'm still going to carry language with me. And language, the language I've learned, is effectively a technology, a cultural object of the culture of the domain from which I'm departing. I've been formed in it. The fact that I've been formed in it doesn't mean that I can't leave, but the fact that I can leave doesn't mean that there's no legacy of it in me. I think one has to be a little more subtle in one's thinking about the relationship between the anarch and the system.
It reminds me of a quote that or to paraphrase something by a philosopher called Michel Serres, who says that man could venture into the Amazon where there's no civilization and not a hint of modernity, but his brain will still be economizing. It's still everything is still going to be appropriated via, as you say, the language which he's sort of inherited from the empire or the civilization or the, as he says, economizing. And it's, I think perhaps, would you say then that sort of one of the practices of the Anarch is to begin to question the sort of the assumptions of their language and why such an Anarch exit is seen as such an almost absurd idea?
I think the exit by the Anarch is a process. It has material sides and spatial sides, conceptual sides and self-reflective sides. Yes, one goes into Sayre's Amazon, or indeed at the end of Eumeswil, Manuel goes into the post-apocalyptic forest. But one still has one's memories, one still has one's language, one still has been shaped as a personality, and one should then begin to scrutinize it. So there are transitions, and I'm not going to say a transition to what, because that always already locks you into a conclusion, and then it becomes another ism. It's a matter of clearing the way to the genuinely new, and the genuinely new, by definition, can't be defined in advance.
So that was one of the questions I was going to ask: is how does the Anarch avoid getting drawn into another ism? So would you say that has, in the sense that the Anarch doesn't get drawn into an ism, the path and passage has to be entirely individual?
Entirely individual. You can have friends, you can have partners, but you have to be aware that you should make decisions on your own. I think there's no guarantee that your path is going to work. I'd start by saying you probably don't want to sign that petition, and maybe you want to limit your dependency on material things, somehow constrain the impulse to consumerism, and this COVID situation certainly gives us an opportunity to pursue that. Although there are other aspects of this situation which are very dismal in light of the novel, I believe. There really is an emphasis on the individual as a decision maker. It's not about individualism, right? It's certainly not a theoretical program for individuality, but it is pointing to the capacity, responsibility, opportunity of each person to make choices and make decisions. Now, the left will respond, well, that's just an illusion because we're all caught up in social structures. And that's why we need the state or the party to organize our lives. And Junger's novel is not going to make the state and the parties disappear, but it can make us aware of degrees of freedom and flexibility and opportunity that we have in shaping our lives, whether it's into a real forest or whether it's carving our way through the jungle of the world in which we live in the city.
Mm-hmm. And sort of I guess some would consider it a controversial question, but you mentioned at the beginning that obviously Junger is seen and perhaps is an elitist. I mean, I think at some point either him or someone else describes him as a natural aristocrat. Do you think Junger believed that everyone could be an anarch, or do you think that he did see that the majority really would always belong to the herd, that they were perhaps too unthinking, and that's why people such as the Condor in Eumeswil existed?
He's an elitist. His elitism takes on different character over the course of his long career. There's a letter that he writes to his brother Friedrich Junger, also an author, and whose book The Perfection of Technology, in English but out of print, is worth reading. His letter of 1934 to his brother Friedrich, where he's commenting very critically about the developments in Nazi Germany 1 year in, and says, how do we preserve our integrity? And part of the answer is just not participating in das Niedrige, the lowly, right? The common. Right? Now this is symptomatic of a certain elite criticism of Nazis that circulated in Germany in the 1930s. That this is the rabble. Huh? Mm-hmm. We're not going to have anything to do with them. But I take someone who's critical of the Nazi rabble over someone who loves the Nazi rabble. And for Junger, that's elitism deployed in an anti-Nazi manner. But it's not a program; it's his inclination. I don't see passages where he's denouncing the masses. I don't see passages where he's denouncing the herd. There doesn't seem to be anything like a biological elitism or a social Darwinism. The oeuvre is extensive, and I may be overlooking a passage, but in general, I think it's more a call for heroism rather than a denunciation of herd-like behavior. There are other critics of democracy who focus on the herd. He doesn't. Right? He focuses on the aspiration to achieve quality, and that one could is in a sense elite, but an aspirational elitism rather than a denunciatory arrogance.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say that other anti-democratic thinkers focus on the herd, and it makes me think of obviously there's sort of two that come to mind, and obviously Nietzsche is the idea of the herd, but also Heidegger and the idea of the they, which is sort of Heidegger's notion of the herd. And Heidegger sort of famously was an anarch in certain senses when he retreated to his hut and was a friend of Junger's, though Heidegger said that Junger was not a philosopher, just a writer. But it seems that the difference there is that Junger then was actually trying to make it accessible to everyone who perhaps did have sympathies for this way of being, unlike others who's just kept on criticizing the herd without actually attending to any practical way of getting away from that which they scorned.
That's right. Yeah. So Jung and Heidegger would be a long, very specialized chapter. Heidegger is a philosopher who uses a very difficult language and chose to live a rural life. Jung is an author who pursued and succeeded in achieving a kind of literary popularity. So they're working in two different modes of writing. I believe that Heidegger does promote a kind of elitism that I suppose one could project onto Junger, but I don't see Junger cultivating that. For Heidegger, there's a disdain for the man or the they, for modern public life. For Junger, there's the aspiration to be better than it, and I think there's an important difference there. There's lots of thinking in the 18th, 19th, 20th century that disdains the masses. One could say that T.S. Eliot does in his descriptions of the masses as mindless, robotic, lacking in substance. I would argue that there's a heavy dose of elitism that is hostile to masses on the left as well, in Lenin, in the sense that you have to have an avant-garde party to lead the dumb working class. That's what Luxemburg reacted against. So there's a continuity. Junger isn't doing that. For him, it could be systematic in the sense that were he to focus primarily on the failings of the masses, the temptation to turn that into an ism would be great. Instead, it's more like modeling a successful life in the midst of a deeply unsuccessful world. That's what I think one finds in Junger.
So that the energy that one expends on criticizing the masses is still feeding that notion of the masses, and really one wants to just remove that energy and apply it to their own creations and their own projects.
I think that I'd want to think about this more, but the rhetoric of a critique of the masses is indicative of a speaking position that one wants to tell the masses how to live. Mm-hmm. These are the kinds of people who want to have administrative jobs. These are the kinds of people who want to run other people's lives, and Junger doesn't want to do that. Junger wants to be able to, or his characters want to be able to live their lives.
Mm-hmm. One just connected to the sort of post-apocalyptic theme and sort of, I think, bridging over to the Anarch. Do you think that the idea of a sort of almost cosmic impermanence and the idea that all civilizations decay is something almost like a first principle for an Anarch, and that they need to understand that nothing is permanent, and that adherence to some state or civilization is just adherence to something that will eventually decay and rot away?
In Eumeswil and otherwise in Junger, there's a sense of conflict, struggle, impermanence in the human condition, I think this shouldn't even be controversial. All things pass, but integrating an awareness of that into one's aesthetic thinking, social thinking, that's the big challenge. And of course, all of this takes place for Junger against the backdrop of regime after regime failing in 20th century Europe. Some of us live in states that have been around for a century or two or many, but some are in states that are quite short-lived.
Yeah, this was one of the themes that came up in the Choron episode when we mentioned Junger, is that Choron's sort of deeply pessimistic view, one can almost root it in the fact that he came from Romania, so very newly formed country, whereas opposed to Junger, who's in Germany, which has been around for a long, long time, and there's this sort of almost a foundation that one doesn't have. It's interesting that you said that it shouldn't be controversial, that all things pass, and yet that seems to be the primary symptom of progressivism, the idea of perpetual progress of whatever it is. The underlying abstract progress is the idea that there is something which will never pass. And I think I would go out on a limb to say that I think Junger foresaw that in such a way as that he tried to make it clear in Eumeswil and some other texts that we need to remember this, and we're entering into a time where technology, which obviously he comments as well, but also the technology in combination with politics is making it possible for us to actually forget this, except obviously to our last breath when we finally have to admit it. I don't know what you'd make of that, but I do think Junger foresaw some of those symptoms.
That's right. In the city-state of Eumeswil, there is a dictator, the Condor, who maintains control. There's no illusion that he's good, but there is a recognition that the state exercises power, and many willingly subordinate themselves to it. But Manuel sees through it and tries to carve out spaces of freedom for himself. There may be a certain critique of the conformist masses inherent in that description of the citizenry of Eumeswil, but I think that the real message on Junger's part is somewhat is pitched a little differently, and that is that the temptations for integration, conformism, subordination are just extraordinary, and they've only grown larger since then. Now, the scope of surveillance is just something Junger probably couldn't even have imagined in his nightmares in 1977. The dissemination of cameras, the extent to which we're tracked on the internet, the extent that we live on the internet and we're tracked there, and add to that the current political atmospherics that seem to encroach on the capacity to articulate heterodox positions in universities, in the press, in the public in general. One takeaway I have from the pandemic experience that I think is consistent with Junger's views is that it's breathtaking the extent to which what we thought were fundamental freedoms could be abrogated so instantaneously and without much judicial review. That's not an argument for or against masks. It's not an argument for or against social distancing, but the fundamental liberties that we thought made up our lives in liberal democracies can just be taken away, and that demonstrates a different endoskeleton to the state that usually is hidden.
So, not to sound too cheap, but there's never been a greater time to start thinking for yourself and become an anarch.
That's right. It's a matter of cultivating a capacity for a critical space around oneself, whether it's just conceptual or taking steps in your life. Although I think those two go hand in hand, and I use the word again, the temptation to return to the flesh pots of conformism are just extraordinarily powerful, and they are hammered at us every day through the media. And the pursuit of a free space that is not already colonized by an ism is vital, and this is particularly important, I think, for individuals who may be attracted to this or that form of specific political engagement. Be very, very careful how much free thinking you're giving up. Critical thinking does not just mean, I have the gotcha moment about this or that politician. Free thinking also involves, I understand how the seemingly critical rhetoric is really just corralling myself into a political agenda. Is there
anything you would like to add on these topics that you think we've missed or glossed over?
We could talk about the novel at length. I want to point out the forest passage as a text I regard as particularly important from 1951. I think many of these themes about freedom and anarchy are already there, and it's a shorter, more direct essay in contrast to the longer novel Eumeswil. Maybe I should point out that we've used the term existential many times as something that's fundamental to the human experience as such. And these existential elements are repetitive. They are what make up our being. It's that term movement that you used earlier. Movement doesn't mean the movement to end nuclear power, or the movement blah blah blah, but the movements in our very lives. Part of that existential dynamic, the existential constant, has to do with an interest in archaic experiences, experiences that have been constitutive of human life, human forms for a long time. Some things just don't change. I think this explains why in some of Junger's texts and in Eumeswil for sure, here and there you see these eruptions of archaic mythological imagery. Mm-hmm. In Eumeswil, it has to do with Icelandic sagas. Now, in early 20th century modernism, you'd also have deployments of archaic material mythology, Joyce, Ulysses. But it works differently in Junger. There's a set of archaic images of heroic battle and defeat that keep recurring, and that's where our lives are. And in Forest Passage, he describes a scene so it's writing around 1950, but he's describing a scene in Berlin in the 1930s, and he talks about, it's an odd hero for Junger, a social democrat or a communist, and the Nazis are at his door, and he fights back. He takes a weapon, and he's acting like, in Junger's view, an ancient Germanic hero fighting for freedom. The ability to draw on that archive of archaic knowledge is vital for Junger.
Mm-hmm. There's a connection here with, and there's not much scholarship on this, but I did an episode on a philosopher called Ludwig Klages, who was alive during the same time as Junger, and I believe there was. I this could be entirely incorrect, but I believe there is actually a direct connection. I think Junger was inspired by Klages, and the mysticism of Klages is very alike that of Junger in the sense of this connection with archaic mysticism and myth, in the sense that it's always underlying. And I think this almost coincides with this idea of violence that we were talking about earlier, that there's these unavoidable underlying precepts of reality, of violence and myth and of a sort of a mystical thing, which as you state, sort of brilliantly, erupt in moments. I'm always reminded of potentially my favorite passage of Junger in Storm of Steel, where he turns. I think he's just arrived in the trenches and he turns into one, and he states, "And I met the great god Pain," as if there was no way he could really describe this other than understanding that the just been an eruption of pain, as if that was its own sensibility in myth.
Yeah, this durability of myth, and particularly the legacy of myths as repositories of knowledge, is a figure of thought in Germany in the period. Klages is enormously important, for example, for Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize-winning author, but also for the Frankfurt School, for Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Unfortunately, they've been sort of appropriated by garden variety left thinking, but there's so much more going on there, and the key claim in their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, is that ancient myth teaches us something still today, because there are characteristics of our lives that remain mythic, and if we delude ourselves into believing that we're in an innocent, peaceful, post-conflict modernity where none of the irrational pertains and only rationality rules, where we've already lost. It's vital to recognize the significance and the extent to which myth continues to operate in complex ways, both as delusion. That's the critical usage of myth, right? But also as a way to know the world. That's what myth was. It was a pursuit of knowledge and a pursuit of power, and it's a pursuit of freedom. There's a lot of that in the figures whom Klages influenced, and one can certainly read Junger that way. He shows us in a mythic world of conflict, how do we navigate it?
That seems, unless you have anything else to add, that seems like a good place to finish up.
Sounds good to me. Thanks so much.